Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Drexel University College of Computing and Informatics Masters of Information in Webinar Series. Today is our third in this series, and today Professor Tim Gorichanaz will present Art as Information. My name is Denise Augusto. I'm the moderator of this series, and I'm a professor here at the College of Computing and Informatics. So take it away, Tim.
All right, thank you. Like Dr. Augusto said, my name is Tim Gorichanaz. I'm assistant teaching professor here. And today I'm going to be talking about some of my work on the concept of art and information. It's not going to be too researchy, but I just wanted to open us up to some new ways of thinking and some new concepts around this topic. So to get us started, you've probably seen this before, if not actually used the app yourself. This is Google's Art Selfie app that was released early in 2018, and it gained steam as the year went on. Particularly towards the end of the year, it seemed like everybody was using it. What this app allows you to do is either submit a picture of yourself or take a selfie, and Google searches their database of art images to see if it can find a match for your face. What I think is really interesting about this is if we look at Google's mission, which is organizing the world's information. And we might ask, if we hear that, what are they doing with making an app like this? Well, Google seems to be onto something, if you ask me, thinking about art as a kind of information. And this Art Selfie app is just one of many examples at the intersection of art and digital information. This is a vast and fast-growing field. There's a huge trend at the intersection here. I'm just going to talk about a few of these fields, but just fair warning that these are contested names, contested definitions, and constantly shifting. But just to give you an idea of what this space is like, one of the earliest forms we've seen here is just broadly called digital art. This is using digital tools to create art. It can be today as simple as drawing a picture on your iPad, but this goes back as long as there have been digital computers since the 1940s, or conceptually even earlier. Next, there's information art, or data art, as it's sometimes called. This is using data and information to produce art. This is somewhat similar to information visualization, which you might be familiar with. Information visualization is just using some form of data. Maybe it's numerical or textual. Maybe there's millions of rows of numbers and you need some way to digest them easier. People are much better at spotting visual patterns than they are at doing mental math on millions of lines of data. And so if you create a visualization, that can help you find new scientific discoveries and draw conclusions. And so information art kind of takes that same idea, but uses it for artistic purposes. Next is software art. This is basically the creation of software as a form of art. One example we see nowadays is code poems, which are written poems, and they look like poems and you can read them, but they're actually also executable programs, which do something, which is also part of the poem. Next, internet art, which is broadly just using the web to create some kind of art. This is interactive, participatory, multimedia. It's not just that you have art that you've posted onto the internet, but that you're actually using the technology of the web or the internet more broadly to create art. Okay, and last, probably the newest entrance to this field is AI art or algorithm art, which is basically using algorithms to make art. An example is machine learning recipes. There's an artist, Janelle Shane, who has basically taken a bunch of recipes, showed them to an algorithm, and had the algorithm create its own recipes for chocolate chip cookies. And they're sort of hilarious and a lot of fun. So this is, as you can kind of see from all these examples, there's a long history of the intersection of information and art. A lot of people point to this exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, in New York City as kind of the foundational moment in it. Information arts, in this sense, was rooted in the conceptual art movement, which sort of flourished throughout the 20th century. And of course, if we look through the history of art, artists have always been at the forefront of experimenting with new technologies. And so we shouldn't be surprised to see that information technology is no different. So when we look at the press release for this information art exhibit at MoMA, we see things like the artists trying to extend the idea of art beyond traditional categories. They said several of the pieces in the exhibition can only be realized with the active participation of people either in or outside of the museum. This was one of the first exhibitions to use photography and television recording as part of the exhibit, and they also showed these recordings back to participants in a sort of feedback loop. And so if this was the first exhibit, it's far from the last. Actually, right now in Philadelphia, there's this exhibit called Designs for Different Futures, which shows, according to the press release, an electrifying landscape of designs that respond to the future in surprising, ingenious, and occasionally unsettling ways. So if you live in Philadelphia or you're able to travel, I think it's up for another month or two. All right, so the point here with all these examples is just that we're being invited to think of art in terms of information more and more. And so what does that mean? On one hand, sure, we can take a painting and scan it, right? Turn this painting to bits. Yes, but I'd like to ask a little more deeply, what does it mean to think of art as information or as informational? Now, first we have to ask this famous question, what is information? What are we talking about in the first place? When we ask ourselves this, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is information in terms of knowledge. We probably think of facts, right? I have the information that I need to make a decision, or I have this information about when the next train is coming, or whatever. Maybe I have this information because I took a class or read a textbook, right? Another form of knowledge or of information, which is information as thing. This is information which is, quote unquote, stored in things like textbooks or articles, right? But there's a third form of information, which is what I'm most interested in, and which is sort of comes to the fore when we talk about art. This is information as a process. Now, this word, we don't use it this way much anymore. It's a bit archaic, but we can see it if we look at the word formation, for example. It kind of gives us this idea of a process. And so just like we can talk about information in terms of knowledge and things, we can also talk about the process of becoming informed. In this way, information is shaping us, and we're invited to think of how we are changed through and with information. I tried to keep this a little accessible so we don't go into too many citations and things, but I couldn't not give this one. This sort of tripartite definition of information comes from Michael Buckland. It's been as one of the most influential papers in information science. It's Information as Thing, published in 1991. So if you're interested in these ideas, I'd encourage you to check out that paper. So if we talk about information as process in this way, it's something that changes you, that shapes you. Well, of course, art has always been informational. In a sense, this is nothing new. The notion that art changes us, shapes us in some way, that we can learn something from art, explains how we come away from certain works of art feeling that we've learned something, right? We see this really well in great literature. Maybe you've come away from reading Proust or George Eliot or Dostoevsky, and we feel like we've learned something. But what have we learned? It's not that we've learned facts, historical facts about life that we can trust necessarily, right? But maybe we've learned something about what it means to live a good life, what it means to live morally or richly or whole. And evidence of this is seen in how we have sort of books commenting on this very fact, such as How Proust Can Change Your Life or My Life in Middlemarch. All right, so the question then, if art is informational, why do we have a special word for art? What makes art special as a kind of information? To discuss this, I'd like to point us to a sort of contrasting example. This is an electrocardiogram printout, which is basically a representation of a heartbeat. So it's informational, but it's not art, at least until an artist gets their hands on it and does something wild with it, get us to see it in a different way. But if you look at it as an EKG printout, it is not yet art. So why is that? One thing that sets art apart is what we can call its inexhaustible quality. This comes from a wonderful quote from the philosopher Catherine Elgin. In one of her recent books, she's discussing art in comparison to other representations, such as the EKG printout. She says, when you're looking at an EKG, only two things matter: the shape of the wave and the frequency with which it repeats. In art, on the other hand, such as in a drawing, any of a vast number of features might matter: the size, shape, color, and the intensity of the line, the weave, texture, and material of the paper, differences, however subtle in shading, from one part of the picture to the next, and so on. And so the picture, she says, is inexhaustible. There's always more to be found. So when we look at an EKG printout, for example, as an EKG printout for the purpose it was made for, we only are looking at two features of it. But with art, there's an endless number of features that we can attend to. There's another quote that I love, which comes from Karl Ove Knausgård, a Norwegian author, memoirist. And in his first book of My Struggle, which is sort of his long, famous, epic memoir, he's talking about visiting many different art museums around Europe. And he says, I was always unsettled when I left them because of what they possessed. The core of their being was inexhaustibility. And what that wrought in me was a kind of desire. I can't explain it any better than that. A desire to be inside the inexhaustibility. So there's something about art which can keep offering more and more. That's because we're always different people at every moment to some extent. We're changing, our context is changing, our situations are changing. And so great art has this inexhaustible quality that it can never run out. All right, so the next question is, given art as information, what can it offer us? And I've broken this down into 3 categories that I'll talk about in more detail. That's moral knowledge, semantic capital, and then belonging and meaning. So first, let's talk about moral knowledge. So moral knowledge is knowledge of how to live and be to have the best life that you can. Now, people debate on whether moral knowledge ultimately exists or whether it's kind of a personal thing. But the point here is that even if art is not explicitly moralistic, it does show us what to notice. It provides us with some knowledge about how we might be in the world, potential actions, potential situations that could come up, and how we can attend to them. One really interesting example that we're seeing nowadays is about seeing the effects of climate change, for example. So the photograph here is from a piece of performance art called Mermaid Tear Factory, where the artist, in some of the instances, this is a photograph from Miami, where she's sort of touring around and then has the main part of the show where she's basically shedding tears because of the destruction of her environment, and humans are wreaking all this havoc because they're not paying attention to the mermaids who live in the ocean. All right, the next one is semantic capital. Semantic capital is a concept from the philosopher Luciano Floridi, and basically it's a type of capital. So capital in its root is a kind of valuable resource. Historically, the word referred to heads of cattle. So, if you have many cattle, you have a lot of capital. Nowadays, maybe our best example is money, right? We think of money right when we think of capital. Semantic capital is kind of valuable resources we have around meaning. So, for example, these are our beliefs, our memories, our cultural practices, right? Things that help us solve problems. And that's why semantic capital is so valuable. So when we talk about problems, some problems, some questions can be answered by simple observation. Some can be answered by doing arithmetic in your head. But some problems, design problems, wicked problems, they can only be solved by using some measure of imagination. And what are the ingredients for imagination but semantic capital? So the image here that I'm showing is a detail of one of Edward Hopper's paintings. And I like this one because it shows some subtle examples of where we might get semantic capital, right? So at first it seems to be a very simple image of a woman looking out a window, right? But we're drawn to sort of the play of the shadows, right? And we're also drawn to ideas about loneliness and maybe part of the urban experience. And so when we engage with images like this, all of those ideas are part of our semantic capital, and maybe they'll come into play in forming architectural design or urban design, urban planning in the future, right? We can never quite know, but the idea is that we're getting all of this fodder for problem solving through semantic capital that we build by engaging with art. And the last way that art affects us is in terms of belonging and meaning, okay? So one of the things is that art helps us see how we fit into the world. And it's part of this, it strengthens community bonds and identity. Public art is a really good example of performing this kind of role. This image I'm showing is from a mural in Philadelphia, which explores the history of slavery. It was produced actually by 2 artists, one who was an inmate and a collaboration with other inmates, and also 5 public schools. And so there's dozens of people overall who were involved in making this. It includes over 1 million glass tiles, and it's over 10,000 square feet. And so we can see how the content of it, the act of its creation, allowed for the participants, allows for the citizens of Philadelphia to reflect on who we are, where we've been, where we're going, and thereby strengthen our bonds of what makes us us. So the point here is that I want us to see art in terms of how it shapes us, right? Maybe, and I'm guilty of this too. When we see art, we might think of, well, is it good or bad, right? Do I like it or not? Maybe we say, is it beautiful or is it ugly, right? Those are good questions, sure, but we should also think about how art is informational. So with the next part of the talk here, I want to focus in on what information professionals can do with art. And I'm going to talk about some examples from libraries, because to me, libraries are sort of the information institution par excellence. But information professionals, I mean, nowadays that is such a broad role. It can be anything from UX and technology designers to designers of all sorts. So some of the examples will be from libraries, but I encourage you to look at the concepts and see how they can be applied to whatever work you might do. So the first way that information professionals might engage with art is by simply increasing access to art. So the problem is nowadays that art may be inaccessible, and maybe that's physically inaccessible because it's in a fancy museum that not everyone can afford to enter to, or it's far away, right? Or it could be conceptually inaccessible because even if you can see the art, you just have no idea what to do with it because it's too abstract or it doesn't speak to you. There are two components in which we can increase access to art. One is simply organization, right? If we think back to the Google Art Selfie app, we have broader efforts like Google Art and Culture and digitization efforts trying to organize and describe and classify and bring art and images of art to wider audiences. Next is education, helping people understand or learn to approach art and incorporate art in their lives. And a really great example of information institutions that are already doing this are with art lending libraries. This has been a trend over the past few decades, particularly at university libraries, but we're seeing it more and more just in the past couple of years. So the photo here is from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. It's called the Octopus Initiative. And what they're trying to do is offer any resident of Denver the chance to borrow and live with a work of art made by a Denver-based artist for 10 months, and it's completely free. No one pays anything to take part in this. So that's a really wonderful example. Another trend we're seeing is artists in residence at public libraries. And so here's an image of the artist in residence at a library in Texas. And basically the artist has studio space. They might put on some kind of programming, and this gives community members the opportunity to see an artist in action. It's not, some weird genius who lived in the 1500s, right? Somebody who's alive today. And learn to understand how to live with art, basically. All right, next is offering art making experiences. So one obvious way is to offer programming that's centered around art and art making experiences. But importantly, this needs to involve recognizing the knowledge generating function that art making has. It's not just a diversion. It's not just something to do, because you have some spare time or because you need to occupy the kids. It actually serves this role that I've been talking about. So a few examples of that are makerspaces. We see makerspaces nowadays in a lot of libraries and universities and in more and more different types of organizations. Oftentimes these are sort of digital tech focused, but sometimes they are also artistically focused. And another example I wanted to highlight comes from my own dissertation research, which I did in summer 2018. In my research, I studied artists creating self-portraits and sort of a lot of academic questions around that. But as part of the project, I was able to have an exhibition on campus here at Drexel. And we showed the self-portraits that were created as part of the project. And at the closing reception, community members were invited to come and take part in a workshop where they created their own self-portraits. So first they were led through a sort of self-questioning, introspective exercise, and then they were given a lot of time and food and drinks to create self-portraits. And at the end of the workshop, attendees were invited to sum up their experience in a single word. And so we heard a lot of really interesting words here: tragic, celebration, collaboration, introspection, confusing, calming. Many people expressed that they learned new things about themselves just from doing this seemingly simple activity. Some people chose to share that, and other people just said thank you. So that was really nice. The next way that information professionals can engage with art is by watching artists and seeing what they're doing. As I mentioned before, artists are often at the forefront of technological change, experimenting and seeing what we can do with new technologies. So because of that, artists often pave the way to new ways of doing things. And so the question here is, can we learn from the artists? Can we take some of their ideas and implement them into systems that we're building? So a really interesting example of this is this project Astronaut. You can look at it online at astronaut.io. And what this does is it presents an alternative way to filter and find content. Okay, so Astronaut, if you go to this website, what it will do is it will show you some little snippets of YouTube videos that were uploaded in the past week or two that haven't had any views yet, or maybe they've had only very few views. You might know that every minute, several 100 hours, I don't know the exact number, it's always increasing astronomically, but multiple 100 hours of video are being uploaded on YouTube every minute, and there's no possible way for people to watch those. Compounded with the fact that our recommendations are given to us based on what's already popular and what people are already talking about and what you're already likely to like based on what you've watched before. So that's how Amazon works, how YouTube, all these recommendation systems, how they work. And so what this Astronaut project invites us to do is think about, is there a different way to organize and present content, right? This is an art project, but maybe there's a way that we can leverage it, right? Another example of this is this project by Leo Salvaggio, which is called the You Are Me prosthetic mask. As you might know, facial recognition technology and surveillance are becoming increasingly important and urgent to think about. And so this artist basically created a prosthetic mask of his own face, which was designed so that facial recognition algorithms and surveillance cameras and the like would recognize it as his face. So it will fool these cameras. And so he offers these for sale, and you can buy them. And so this is a really interesting artistic intervention, and it raises questions about surveillance and facial recognition, what these technologies mean. So this is the kind of thing that artists can do when it comes to new technologies. And basically my point here is that we should pay attention to what they're doing and take them seriously. Next, and last, is that we can use art to shine a light on important issues. Okay. So as I've kind of been saying, art can show us what's possible and what actually in the culture today deserves our attention. So whether that's facial recognition technology or whatever. And another piece of this is that art operates at a slower pace. So we're hearing all these things about information overload and the attention economy and how we don't have time to think and all this. The 24-hour news cycle, right? All these things are constantly happening. Our Twitter feeds are blowing up. But art, as I said, operates at a slower pace. And so engaging with art gives us the opportunity to look at these important issues in a sort of more calmer, reflective way. So one simple and interesting way that we can use art to shine a light on important issues is as simple as putting together a display in the public library on fiction, which includes LGBT characters, for example, showing that these ways of life are possible and accepted. As we know from research on identity formation, people need to see what identities are possible and at play in a given cultural setting. And displaying them is one way to do that. I should note here that such displays are famously controversial, especially in more conservative areas, for example. But this is also an important role of art, being controversial. So I know that this is a very touchy subject, and there can be a lot of political and practical issues, but I just wanted to raise it as one of the functions of art. Another example sort of related to the facial recognition type technology is this project, This Person Does Not Exist. So this came out of some research that was done by NVIDIA, where basically they took a lot of photographs of humans, faces, and showed them to an algorithm to the point where the algorithm was able to generate its own fictional people. So on one hand, that's sort of a science project, if you want to put it that way. But by creating this website, thispersondoesnotexist.com, which you can go to right now, what happens when you go to this website is you're confronted with an image of a person who does not exist. And so on one hand, this looks like a real person. It's extremely lifelike, it looks like a person. I mean, what else can we say about that? But the name of the website really gives us pause. So that's an interesting way that art can shine a light on, we have this technology. What does it mean? We don't really think about these questions too much sometimes. And then lastly, I just wanted to show this again. If you were looking at my title slide, you saw these images. This is from a Korean art duo, Shin Sung-baek, Kim Young-hoon, and it's called Cloud Face. Basically what they did was they used facial recognition systems and showed pictures of clouds to them. And basically the machine made an error, obviously, seeing faces in the clouds. And what's really interesting is that humans also see faces in the clouds. A lot of these you can probably see as faces. And so they talk about how the machine's error and the human imagination are meeting in this project. So this is a really another really interesting example. So what I've showed today are just a few examples of what might happen if we can see art as actually informative and not just a pleasant diversion. And I hope I sparked some ideas maybe even questions. Before we move on to questions, I just wanted to give a few examples. If you're interested in exploring these ideas further, there's 3 books which came out in the past couple of years, written by artists. The first one, actually the first and the last one just came out last year. The middle one came out a few years ago, so 2016. The first one, How to Disappear, is thinking about, we're in this time of sharing, everyone's trying to share. And so what are we losing? What is important about having a private space just for me? And how can we reclaim that? The middle one, Wasting Time on the Internet, actually comes from a course that Kenneth Goldsmith taught. Maybe he still teaches, but it's called exactly that, Wasting Time on the Internet. And so speaking of internet art, this book has a lot of really interesting examples and reflections on how we can use computers and the internet generally as a sort of artistic intervention. And then the last one by the artist Jenny Odell, How to Do Nothing, is really thinking about how to reclaim some of this time and space by engaging with the world a little more artfully. That's all. Thank you for your attention. You can get in touch with me at these addresses as you see here. And I think we also should have time for questions. So if anybody on the chat, I don't know exactly how I should handle this. If you're on the chat, if I can manage to pull up the chat window, you can ask a question. There we go. Should I read it out loud? That's good, right? So this is not a question. This is coming from Denise. This is not a question, but something that really excited me. When I toured Brandeis University a few months ago, the tour guide said that students could check out pieces of art from the University Art Museum to put in their dorm rooms to enjoy and share. I thought it was a fantastic way to make art a functioning part of the community. Absolutely, yeah. Depending on the museum, they have anywhere from less than 10% of their art actually on display at any given moment. So they have so much stuff in storage. So I mean, there's legal and liability insurance type issues that need to be considered here. But yeah, absolutely, universities were among the first, I think, the first to pioneer this idea of an art lending library for the students to put in their dorms. And so, I mean, when we think about how stressful college can be, right? Having some wonderful art on your wall that can stimulate you in all the ways that I was talking about, absolutely valuable. Yeah. Jenna, can you tell us where information and art fit into the typical library and information science curriculum? Is it a freestanding course or more embedded orthogonally? That is a really interesting question. So one thing that we're doing here at Drexel, we just reorganized our master's program, and we're requiring all the students in their first year to take a design class. So it's called Design Thinking Through Information. Oh my gosh, all these courses have long titles, right? Design Thinking, Information Innovation Through Design Thinking. That's the title. And so design and art, I mean, we can have a lot of discussions on the relationship between design and art, but at least the way I approach it, and I'm teaching it this quarter, which is extra embarrassing that I can't remember the name of the actual course. It has a lot of these sort of artistic exercises, and I get the students drawing and reflecting on their work and their practice. I think there absolutely is a lot of ways that we can incorporate artistic art making and art reflection in the classroom more orthogonally, as you mentioned. For example, for those who don't know, Jenna Hartel has a lot of great work on this I-Squares project, where students are invited to create a visual representation of the concept information. What is information? What is your definition in the form of a picture? And to me, that's, I mean, it has this sort of scientific quality to it, but it can also be engaged with artfully. On that point, I mean, we can also engage with an EKG printout artfully, right? If you're looking at it as an EKG, it just tells you this data about the person's heartbeat. But maybe if you attend to those grid lines in the background, or if you start looking at the negative space, or if you start looking at it in the way that we see faces in clouds, it starts to become art. And so to me, art is not necessarily this objective category of things, but rather it's a sort of relationship you have. It's sort of about that process of information again. So yeah, I would absolutely love to see a course, specifically around art as a type of information, but I'm not sure. The problem with library education and information science education is there's so many courses and it's so hard to pack them into 2 years. And so that's an ongoing challenge, but yeah, wonderful. So Jenna can attest that students at the University of Toronto, Faculty of Information would love a freestanding course. Yes. I think maybe more is typing. Yeah. She feels that our students are artists themselves, bursting with creativity, and we don't provide enough outlets. I've seen that even in my own courses here at Drexel, actually, which is sort of known as being a very computation-heavy, digital program, where we have a lot of students who are aching for this kind of engagement. But yeah, the curriculum doesn't seem to offer it. I wonder if there's pressures from the ALA or analogous bodies, when it comes to accreditation. Yeah, that's a big question. Okay, we've got a question in the room here. So are there any recommendations for studying art as information? Methods I have used or have learned from studying art methodologically? Yeah, that's interesting. So there's a whole area called arts-based methods, which is a way of doing research, not on art or artists per se, but using artistic methods as a form of research and creating art as a research product. And it's facing a lot of challenges right now in academia, being accepted, right? For example, if you write a poem, it's probably not going to get published in the top journals in your field. If you create a painting, it's not going to be published, right? And so at present, the pieces that I'm aware of also have to come with sort of like a scholarly explanation to make it kind of fit a little more. I tried this actually a couple of years ago. I wrote a paper it ended up getting published in Journal of Documentation, but it's just a sort of dialogue between two people. So it's sort of silly. But the point was, it was about information experience and, what is it like to engage with information? And in this case, what is it like to engage with a piece of scholarship? And why is it that way? And why does it have to be that way? And so instead of just presenting that dialogue as itself, I had an introduction and a conclusion, which had all the citations and that. So yeah, there are, I would encourage you to look at arts-based methods if you're interested in that. There's a lot of precedent for that, but the challenge is kind of acceptance and really communicating what is the knowledge that we're gaining from this to the academic community. We had another question baked in that I kind of forgot about, but we have another question online. So there's a case to be made for librarians as collaborators and preparing data from their collections with artists in mind. We have a link to a site, which I am not sure what will happen if I click the link right now, but try it. Okay, linked jazz, cool. And Tim Sifdar is our CCI liaison librarian, for those who don't know. So, this looks really interesting. So yeah, so this is one of my sort of ongoing areas of interest, is this link between artists and information professionals. The philosopher Nelson Goodman had this really wonderful book that came out in the 70s called Languages of Art. And towards the end of the book, he talks about how artists organize experience for the rest of us. And I thought that was quite interesting, because information professionals organize experience for the rest of us also. And so this is only something that I'm just starting to think about, but what can information professionals learn from artists as far as ways of doing their work? Maybe there's a lot that we can look into, and maybe this is one example. Great. So, all right, so I'm going to turn it back to Denise for a little closing comment here.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. That was absolutely fascinating. Of course, got me very excited seeing your ideas for connecting communities to art through libraries. Because as a library and information science professor, nothing's closer to my heart than libraries. Thank you all for taking part. This webinar was recorded. It will be edited and will be on our college website in case you'd like to go back and review it or share it with others. Also, please consider taking part in our next webinar in the series on February 4th, which is a Tuesday, from noon to 1 p.m. We will have the next webinar, which will be called Saving My Web Things for Me and Others, but Not for All. Be presented by Matt Kelly, and he will be talking about stuff in the web and how we use the web to preserve stuff. It will be a free webinar just like this one, Tuesday, February 4th at noon, and you can sign up for it on our website. Thank you, everybody.